right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Kimball. I'm a product specialist here at Aplos, and I'll have the privilege of talking with you and sharing some information with you for the next little while. We are going to talk about keys to church financial stewardship. And so that's going to be our topic today. So if whether you work in a church, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a volunteer, a layperson, hopefully there'll be a little takeaway information for everybody. Let's dive in here a little bit. And like I said, utilize the question box. I'll spend a lot of time at the end doing that. But by way of introduction, you probably might have already seen a little bit of this. Just know that, what we're going to be talking about today is some of the things that make a church financially healthy, what tools you might need to see where you're at, and maybe some goals to aim for. So we're going to talk about some stewardship principles. Stewardship can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, so we'll define that a little bit. We're going to talk about a stewardship plan, talk about some accountability suggestions, as well as we're going to look at some reports, some financial reports that can help you maybe make better decisions and choices for your church or congregation, and then talk a little bit about some giving trends that you can be looking for. So my hope is that there's some practical application for everybody at some level, regardless, no matter if you're big, small, first time, whatever, we can learn something a little bit. So let's start by just defining stewardship a little bit. Again, it can be defined by a variety of different ways. I particularly like this. I particularly like this definition. Sorry if I cut out there for a second, about stewardship as our response to God's goodness and grace in the ways we use our time, our talents, and our financial resources. So it begins with the foundational principle that the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. So we probably, those who have been in church or worked in the church, know that everything belongs to God. And our job as stewards of the earth, obviously, is how we treat and take care of the things that God has given us. And so although stewardship is not limited to finances, how we use our money becomes very important. So mostly people, when they think stewardship and church stewardship, they really think about money. And money is a really important way of expressing our faith. I like the last part of this definition, which is nearly a third of Jesus' teaching has to do with this topic. So you see, you've got your treasure, your time, your talent, and our role as a church is to kind of not only, share God's goodness with one another, but also to manage the resources that each of us are given within our own church congregation, ministry, mission organization, lay mission, whatever that place is. And so if I use the term congregation or church, please know that extends out to mission organizations. If you are a faith-based nonprofit, if you're doing work that doesn't necessarily live within four walls of a church building, please know that the takeaway could be very similar with that. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about is that stewardship. So I think a good place to start is talk about some core principles for stewardship. Again, you can there's tons of information out there about different definitions. Some denominations have their own different set of focuses, but I just kind of wanted to start with some general principles that I think we can think about as we talk about how do we best steward our church money and the things that we want to accomplish. I really like Bill Cox. Bill Cox represents what I particularly like about him is that he's not a pastor or a theologian, but he's a layman. He's a businessman that has done a lot of work in churches. And so he talks about common biblically based theme in the church world that would be good stewards of money. God has entrusted them. And he talks about especially when it comes to paying tithes and giving generously. He says stewardship not only applies to the church members, but also to churches themselves. In the same way that individuals are accountable for how they invest in the resources God has given them, churches and ministries are responsible for how they steward the gifts that come into their storehouse. So I think this is an interesting thing because a lot of times when we talk about stewardship, we talk about personal responsibility in terms of how much I should give to my church or how much time, what talent should I give back. But the church's role and your role with the church, again, whether you are a layperson, a volunteer, a pastor, a church finance person, we all have a job in terms of making sure that that those resources are being taken care of and watched over carefully. And what's interesting is we're going to talk about this a couple of times throughout, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to do with always getting more money. In other words, there are churches that have a lot of resources that aren't always stewarding them as well either. So this can kind of come from two different directions. So Bill Cox kind of suggests 7 principles that I just want to highlight. Again, this is his work, and I'm just kind of recapping them because I thought of some of the research I've done and some of the pastors that I interviewed during the past several weeks really concurred with these 7. The first is these are 7 principles that can further the impact of the ministry in building the kingdom of God. And I think what this does is it attempts to show the importance of allocating financial resources in a way that is aligned with your mission, vision, and values of a ministry. And every church should have a mission and vision. And if you don't, you should really work on that. And I think the idea of stewardship is that your stewardship program should be in line with what it is you're trying to accomplish in your mission and vision, whether that's, reaching out to your own community or, bringing more people to the Lord or whatever that core mission is. So let's kind of highlight these 7 real quickly. Again, I'm not going to go into tons of detail for sake of time, but I really like these as good 7 principles to start with. The first is prayer and planning go together. Great point. Sometimes people, have said that God blesses order and not chaos, meaning that sometimes churches approach stewardship as, hey, whatever God gives us, we're going to be happy about, and we're just going to see what God does, and as it comes in, that's great. And so there's kind of a balance here. It reminds me of there's a kind of a funny parable or story about a guy who is caught in a flood somewhere in the south, and the flood waters rise, and a guy on a boat comes by and says, "Hey, get in, we're going to save you." And the guy says, "Don't worry about it. God's going to save me." And so they move on, and then a little while later, a sheriff comes by in a speedboat. He says, "Hey, hop in. You're going to drown." He says, "Don't worry about it. God's going to save me. I'm good." He takes off. A little while later, the flood rises more. The guy's standing on his roof, and a helicopter comes by, and they shout out over the loudspeaker, "Hey, get in the helicopter. You're going to die." And the guy says, "Don't worry about it. God's going to save me." And well, the bad news is the guy ends up dying. He drowns. And he goes to heaven, and he goes up to Peter at the gate and says, "What happened?" And he says, "Well, I sent you a rowboat, a speedboat, and a helicopter, and you didn't take any of the 3." So, anyways, that's a kind of a reminder that God does give us resources, and we have to take advantage of those. So the point here is that prayer and planning go together. So there's really no biblical rule that prevents a plan from being aggressive or optimistic within reason. So there needs to be faith and there needs to be planning. So you as a church should kind of find that balance, what works for you. Some churches spend several months praying before they plan. Some pray and plan at the same time. But I think the point of this is that prayer and planning need to go together. So if God has given you a vision for a larger ministry, be faithful stewards of those visions and plan accordingly. So that's kind of a real good point. Second, visions need resources. We talked about that a little bit. That churches need money for growth. That's the bottom line. In the business world, people would say that kind of the 2 predominant reasons for the failure of a business is undercapitalization and mismanagement. In other words, there's not enough money to fund growth until that business is self-sustaining, or management poorly stewards the available capital. The same could be true for churches, in that you can say, hey, my church is doing the best it can with the money we have. but maybe there's some resources available that you're not taking advantage of. So if you are a pastor or you are, say, a church administrator that's on this webinar and you're feeling sort of that pressure of, I've got to do everything, maybe you want to look around at what resources you have that kind of meet the vision of your church. So I think the point kind of we're trying to make is that, you want to have vision, you want to have exciting plans for your church, but you also need to invest in the resources you need. Sort of that classic example is people think, they don't want to grow their church, or do something new for the church, but doing something new for the church, like maybe building a new building or painting the congregation or changing the seating might bring in more people. Something like that. So think about those resources. Third point, information is powerful. I think this is a great financial stewardship model in that, many times we don't look at information to make good decisions. In other words, we just think, oh, well, God's going to do what God's going to do, instead of saying, how is information being presented? Kind of a common, way you do that is if you were going to do a new project, if you were going to build something or do a major project for your church, usually you're going to ask the following questions. How much is it going to cost? How much do we have? Can I do this in stages? Is financing an option? Those would be some real basic questions you want to ask. Well, the same is going to be true with how are you presenting information to your church and to your church leadership. In other words, as soon as you pull out a financial report, are the eyes starting to glaze over and people starting to nod off, or they don't even understand what it is they're reading? For me, coming out of the nonprofit sector, this would be something, and we're going to show you an example of that here in a few minutes. But this is something that you as church leaders and people that represent missions can do probably in this day and age with technology, is really show information that is useful and contains valuable details that people understand and can clearly read. And that's what fund accounting is about. And we're going to kind of jump into that here in a bit. So utilize that information and try to draw out information that can be useful for you. Fourth, the budgeting process is your friend. Some churches hate the budgeting process. I think that annual budgeting is an opportunity to set priorities. It's also a good time to dream in terms of maybe you have a missions department and a youth department and a women's ministry. These are good times to let those people dream a little bit and let that budgeting process be a positive one in terms of stretching yourselves as leaders, but also stretching the congregation with those budget. You've heard of maybe a faith budget, where people say, hey, we're going to really go out, this year. We really believe that, God is moving in this way or that way. I think that, the leadership of a church, whether that's volunteer or paid, can review departmental budgets with their leaders for soundness and conformity to the overall vision of the church. Is it match kind of where you guys are headed? And it can be, I think it can be a lot of fun. I actually am one that really enjoys budgeting. I enjoy the dreaming process. I enjoy getting input from different people on what it is, where they're headed, that kind of thing. Next, cash reserves should be responsible. This is going to be something we're going to come back to here a little bit towards the end of the webinar, which is, how much cash should you have? How much cash reserves is responsible for a church? Is it different than a nonprofit? Should you be stacking up a lot of money, that rainy day fund? And we're going to come back to that, because that amount can be based off a number of factors, and it's not all. There's not one rule of thumb on this one. For example, the church that I attend, they were sitting on a lot of savings for a number of years, and they as a church finally came to a point where they said, look, we've got some major issues in the church that we need to address. Issues meaning not people issues, but they had some outdated air conditioning and heating units and some things that just needed to be fixed to the point where people were very not happy because it was so miserable. So they decided it's time to sort of spend down those reserves and invest into our church again. Again, that was one example. So what you as a financial principal want to do is look at your cash reserves and figure out, what works for us. What do we need to have, and what do we need to not have to be still, be responsible. We're going to get into that. All types of debt are not equal. This is an interesting principle that I really think people ought to think about, which is some people hear the word debt and they automatically look at that as a negative, where there can be acceptable debt in churches and in ministries if the debt produces income to repay that debt. Obviously, you don't want to finance a project so unbelievable high that it puts strain on the leadership in the church, but also there needs to be some faith in that, but also some responsibility. So you want to kind of be looking at that. And then the seventh and the last principle, which I really like this one, is emphasis on money should be balanced, meaning, raise your hand. I can't really see you, but how many of you, don't talk about money at all? And how many do you feel like the church, that's all they talk about is money? And it's kind of finding that balance. I come from a nonprofit fundraising background, so I'm always like, we need to talk about money more. We need to be asking for money more. And some people are like, no, we need to kind of tell a little differently. So you want to kind of find that balance. Good stewards manage their money well, but balancing the demands of the day-to-day with the needs to invest in the future. In other words, if all your congregation is feeling like you're doing is asking, and they're not hearing enough stories on the other end, then they might get kind of burnout, things like that. So good stewards recognize this, and they pray for guidance, and they pray for what that balance should be, is how much should we ask for money and how much should we not ask for money. So 7 principles I think are good kind of reminders as we think about stewardship and we talk about money within our church. So hopefully there's a few takeaways there. Let's just kind of pause for a second. I'm just going to kind of look at the Q&A. Good. All right. Going to keep going. Again, if you have any questions, any feedback on this, you can certainly just type those in, and we'll deal with those at the end of the time together. Sorry. Just going to do one little technical thing here. Good. We're good. All right. Next point, kind of in a kind of a major point of this webinar is going to be talking about a stewardship plan. I really do believe that all churches should implement a stewardship plan at some level. Some larger churches have the resources to actually have a stewardship person, a person who's in charge of stewardship. Some have committees. Some just kind of, Band-Aid their way through this. But I really think the best way to cultivate a deep-rooted spirit of stewardship in your congregation is to actually create a plan to accomplish it. So one of the starting points is you want to brainstorm with your team what you think you can do throughout the year to communicate that vision, and get regular feedback, and give people opportunities to further participate. This is much like in the fundraising world, we call it, there's a stewardship plan with how you're kind of taking care of your donors throughout the year. There's also a fundraising plan. But in this case, what I'm going to kind of present or suggest is that churches that are doing stewardship well focus on it more than a couple of weeks in the fall. In other words, everyone knows stewardship season. It's like, usually right around Thanksgiving or early October, and they pound on it for a few weeks. They have people pray about their pledges. First of the year, they get their envelopes, and boom, they're done. And I think there's a lot of really creative and really interesting things you can do as a year-round plan. And this literally is writing out a calendar, a 12-month plan about how you can be always talking about stewardship in your church. And what's interesting is it does not have to be always about asking for money. And I'm going to give you some suggestions here about what that looks like. Herb Adler offers one comprehensive plan that a church might use well in developing a year-round strategy. And these would be the components in a year-round strategy. And every church might, look at it different. But going on the left side of my screen, first of all, personal witness can be involved, meaning that people stand up and they talk about how they've seen, God working through the church or something like that. Of course, we all know about preaching. Again, a third of the New Testament is about money, so there's plenty of that. Some pastors absolutely cannot just they break out in hives thinking about preaching about money. Understand that, but it should be done. And maybe if you are not the one to do it, maybe you need to bring in somebody or find somebody who's willing to preach about it. Telling stories. I mean, I'm a big believer in storytelling. In some of my past webinars, we talk about the power of storytelling. And I think that because Jesus himself was a storyteller, I think the church has a great opportunity to tell stories about how the work that's being done. Making an annual emphasis, meaning that throughout the year, not just 1 or 2 weeks out of the year, we talk about stewardship. Again, stewardship involves time, talent, and treasure. Again, that can involve a lot of things. Tithing is year-round, meaning that people tithe throughout the year, and so doing events and program around that tithing, making it fun, not making it like going to the dentist where it's like, oh, I don't want to do that. That would be another way. The planned giving comment. The planned giving is working with people who can think about including your church or mission in their estate or their will, meaning long-term planning, especially good for retired people, retired couples, older couples who are maybe starting to phase out a little bit of the day-to-day in the church, and maybe they want to make a larger impact. Personal financial management. What a lot of people do is they'll come in and they'll bring in these personal financial management classes in the church and talk about that, but they don't realize that really is part of the overall stewardship plan of your church. So make that, if you're thinking about doing a personal financial management class, make that as part of your 12-month plan. Budget building and management, that's a year-round thing. And then accounting and reporting system, that's actually part of good stewardship, which is keeping good track and having good accounting practices, which we're going to talk about. And then the last point over here to the right is letters for all seasons. I really like the ideas that if you have a regular communication piece with your church, include, write out a plan for January, February, March, April, May, June, so on and so forth. And each time you communicate, think about how you want to include stewardship in that communication. So, your February letter might want to focus on, the season of, whatever that season is you're celebrating. Some churches really utilize Lent and, other traditional calendar items to communicate. But the point being here is that create a plan, utilize a committee or a group of people. Maybe you have a volunteer stewardship committee. A stewardship committee does not have to be a group of people that's just asking for money, but it's just simply looking at how are we as a mission, a ministry, or a church, how are we doing about communicating and allocating our resources throughout the entire congregation. So if I can't emphasize anything, I just want to say that just because you are on a stewardship team or a stewardship committee, it does not have to be just about asking or receiving money. It can be a balance of things. The other thing I want to mention too is that this can also just go not just from the whole church, but then you can also utilize things like the Sunday school programs or adult education hours or youth programs, youth mission trips. They can all be involved as well and be part of the overall plan. So anyways, just kind of be thinking about how you want to implement your stewardship plan. Have an ongoing conversation about generosity and giving. And stewardship should not be the focus for only 2 or 3 weeks in the fall. We kind of already touched on that. So tell stories of impact. Invite congregants to tell their stories of how the church is changing their lives. This helps them examine the impact of the church in their own life and one that is likely shared with others. Help people see the real needs you have, not just a budget bottom line. A lot of people don't even read the budget, but if somebody stands up, somebody from the church, and really explains what's going on or tells a story or something like that, you're going to see a lot of impact as well. But the money is not the main purpose of the church. That's a great comment and a great point. You're right. But testimonials can and should be. So we'll come back to that. Thank you. That's a good comment. Instead of focusing on the building and its needs, shift to thinking of the mission of the building and the things that are happening because people who use the building. So a lot of people say, well, why, so what if the building's getting a little old? But you can say, but look at all the powerful things that are happening because we're being good stewards of our building by letting all these different groups use the building and have ministry and have programming and all of that. So that would be another way. So also in your stewardship plan, again, regularly show gratitude for those who support ministry, whether that's through their time or finances. This is something that I'm kind of becoming more and more passionate about, and I'm learning a lot along the way because I come from a traditional fundraising background where you thank donors, you cultivate donors, and I completely understand that for a lot of churches, the pastors and the church staff don't see what people give, and that's okay. But I still think donors need to feel thanked and encouraged and appreciated. And so I think you can thank supporters and volunteers by giving good updates, by maybe having anonymous letters, meaning that the pastors can still write thank you letters or notes of encouragement to their congregants without knowing how much they gave, but just knowing that they gave some time or some treasure. And also you can thank the leadership. Or you can ask the leadership, to help write those thank you notes to donors or phone calls or things like that. And again, the point here is you don't need to see the amount given to say thank you. And I think people do want to feel appreciated and they want to feel valued. So that needs to be part of that stewardship plan is how are you doing appreciation and thanking people for their involvement. You're trusting them with those resources. And you can implement recurring online giving. That could be part of your stewardship plan. This is a convenient way for people that to plan to tithe that sometimes miss because they were out of town or forgot their checkbooks. It also helps the church plan its finances if giving is more predictable. This, for me, is probably one of the greatest opportunities churches have to kind of increase, especially as church attendance is changing, the way in which people are going to church is changing. And so I think reoccurring giving or online giving can be a real powerful way to help those stewardship issues. And so just again, a reminder, enhancing your church stewardship strategy takes time. It's not just about raising money, it's about changing mindsets. So I think a stewardship plan is a kind of a good thing. The next point I want to talk about for a few minutes is just accountability. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. These notes will be available to you. But again, one of the things you want to do as stewards and stewardship practices is show accountability. Have a comment here from Carly. 65% of our members giving comes from online giving. That is really awesome, Carly. We'll come back to that in the Q&A, but that's a great number. So congratulations on that. 65% of their members are giving online. That's really great. You want to establish a budget and live within it. So one of your roles as good stewards is to practice good discipline, meaning that there's checks and balances, meaning that establish a realistic budget, but also don't go off the rails too fast if it's time to stretch that budget a little bit. The next point within the accountability is communicate. Can't emphasize that enough. It is possible to spend too much time talking about money. So that's on the one hand. I want to recognize that if that's all you're doing, then people, you're kind of losing out on those on the mission of the church, which one of our comments was just about that. But we can also spend too little time talking about money. So we got to kind of find that balance. We need to overcome our fear of being misunderstood. So one of the things you can do is just financial updates. You can do that in your weekly worship bulletins, worship folders, monthly updates. I'm not a huge advocate of doing, big financial statements, but I think you can do little snapshots and little screenshots of cash flow and budget need to be most helpful. What is it what you need right now for people to step up? Stewardship messages could be once a year. Preaching, isn't enough, but but it could be messages throughout the year, and other opportunities for giving, whether that's highlighting missions, highlighting some of the other ministries and things going on. Most churches' business meetings include financial reports, but take time to communicate. Is a really appropriate and important. You can do this through prayer meeting announcements. You can do it through congregational letters. And last but not least, you can do it through testimonies. These are ways not only to encourage stewardship, but also to talk about accountability, to let people know that things are happening with those time, treasure, and talent that is being given to the church. So this is about the church trusting those who are in leadership to know that good things are happening because of the generosity and the faithfulness of those members and mission partners, for lack of a better term. So these are ways in which you can encourage, and I'm a big believer in transparency, whether you're a nonprofit, a church, a mission, anything like that, is just being an open book, showing, and being honest when things are tight, coming to the congregation saying, hey, maybe we had an unpredictable event. We here at Aplos, we have a lot of customers who have been in parts of the country that have been, really suffered through a lot of unfortunate events, fire, flood, and other. And they've had to be very honest with their congregations about relief efforts and things like that. So, part of your roles is not only just creating those stewardship plans, but also communicating good accountability practices with that. So, you want to demonstrate accountability. Every church needs to regularly examine its own practices of how you're handling the money. These suggestions below are just a few thoughts. This is not a sense of a manual, but I do think that each church should develop its own sort of kind of checks and balances, depending on in terms of how you collect your money, how you log your incoming checks, what software you're using and who's using it, how the offering's being counted, how the offering's being deposited, how the offering's being, who's taking the money where. Again, you always want to assume that everybody can be trusted, but you just never know. How checks are being signed, especially small churches. This is a challenge because again, here at Aplos, we have a lot of startup churches, folks where, you've got the husband who's the pastor and the wife who's the finance person. That's fine. But, you want to make sure there's a third party involved, just to check things out a little bit. You want to have your financial records reviewed annually. Again, that's not necessarily for fraud, but just for an outside third party. Don't necessarily have to have that paid for, meaning, but a lot of churches do use accountants and outside third party bookkeepers just to get a sense for what's going on. Let me just check here on the questions here real fast. Make sure we can kind of keep going here. Okay, good. And then lastly, take time to put the financial house of the church in order. If you take the time to put your financial house in order, then it will pay richly, with other people knowing that, we have people that are really doing a good job tracking all of this. And again, this isn't always just about trying to get more money, but it's also just reporting back with the money that you do have. Okay. And then, so now let's talk a little bit about financial reports. So this is kind of a next kind of main point of our webinar, which is using financial reports to make strong financial choices. So, in other words, what can you look at to help you better make decisions for your church? I think there's two primary factors to consider whether or not your church is financially healthy. One is your budget, and two is your giving practices. Your budget is, does your church pay its expenses on time? Do you have adequate emergency funds, and does your church maintain sufficient undesignated reserves? That's just kind of a thermometer to kind of a check-in. Is your church's giving campaigns effective and ongoing? Is your church membership support missions beyond the local church? And is your church building towards expansion or just treading water? And expansion doesn't necessarily mean a building. Expansion could be, growth of programs and things like that. So these are just kind of, thermometers or readings that you can take to get a sense. And so if you're wondering, well, how do I tell? We can look at reporting. So we're going to kind of spend the next few minutes talking about fund accounting and what good a fund accounting looks like. We threw that question out at the beginning. We had several of you who are very familiar with it. We had a few of you that said, I don't even know what fund accounting is. Because we are a fund accounting software, we're going to talk about it. I have talked about fund accounting in some of my past webinars. So if you are a repeat webinar I don't know what to call you, a webinar viewer, listener, know that that I'm going to repeat a few things here that maybe you've already heard, but it's a good reminder. First of all, fund accounting is a method of accounting that nonprofits and churches use that really illustrate accountability rather than profitability. In other words, business accounting, what you're really checking is profit and loss. How much did you make money or did you lose money? In churches and missions and nonprofits, what you're really doing is it's not about profit and loss. It's about money that's given and money that's being designated somewhere. And what do we do with it? Because you all know that there's going to be money left over each year or a balance, and that needs to go somewhere. So it's where the money's coming from, which are your assets. What are your expenses? And how is that money being used for the specific purposes? So you want to track very specific funds, what's going where, and that's where fund accounting comes into play. So you're going to track your funds correctly is essential for nonprofit reporting. So not only are you tracking your cash balances, but your income and your balance sheets. These are going to be three ways to really track that. So what we do with fund accounting is we give you the ability, obviously, to see what you have in your reserves. This would be like a balance sheet. This would be a good report to look at to say, hey, how are we doing as a church? Again, this is maybe a little high because this is a sample account that I put together. It shows I have $2 million in checking. Well, that's really good, actually. But you can kind of look at, by simply looking at a report to kind of get a sense of, it's like going to the doctor. The doctor goes and says, hey, your heart's good. You're a few pounds overweight or underweight or whatever. You could do a little bit more of this or that. It's just getting a sense of where you're at. So you can use a financial report to make good, strong choices in terms of what do we need to work on, what do we need to be careful of, what can we celebrate, and what can we do a little differently, kind of thing. But with fund accounting, this is where fund accounting gets in right up really important, which is you can see at the very top of this report, you've got your general fund, your mission fund, your building fund. This is what a good fund accounting program can help you do. In a church or mission, you're not just tracking a general fund, but you're tracking very specific programs or purposes, and you're able to track the income and expenses to each one of those. Where with a lot of business accounting programs like QuickBooks and things like that, they have a little bit of a tougher, you can do it, but it's just a little bit of a tougher way to really figure out what's going on. And so what happens, my experience on like a church board and nonprofit boards has been people don't really understand how to read the financial statements because they can't see clearly how much is coming and going to each one of those funds. So you see here, you have one checking account, and within that checking account, you can track how much is in my general fund, my missions fund, my building fund. So you can also see kind of a percentage. How much are we giving to missions, and how much is coming and going. So that's kind of the overall idea. One of my colleagues, Alex Acree here at Aplos, does a much more detailed and in-depth webinar on fund accounting. If you're interested in that, just go to our aplos.com, click webinars, and you can sign up for a more detail. But I just want to give you kind of a taste of how reports can help you with your stewardship and making decisions. This would be another, in a sense, way you can utilize fund accounting. You see here, you've got maybe a men's ministry, a women's ministry, a youth ministry. You can see where the income comes from because, many churches, income comes from different places, not just tithes and offerings, but maybe fundraising. Maybe you have a program like a coffee cart, or maybe you sell T-shirts or CDs or whatever. But then you can look at your expenses as well. So by very simply looking at with each fund, the income and expenses, you can make some very good decisions as a stewardship leader about, what do we need to be careful of? What do we need to watch for? Where can we grow? Where can we stretch? And where do we need to maybe kind of hold back a little bit? And so I think, again, my frustration with, reports in the past has been a lot of reports are so, filled with information that nobody really knows what they are. But I think you can really simplify your reports. Last one will show. This would be another way where you can actually look at, again, general income, and then against your expenses, how much we spend on different things. So again, this is an Aplos report that I'm showing you. Certainly, again, if you're using another accounting program and you're happy, that's awesome. But just wanted to show for those of you who are new to Aplos, the kinds of things we can do within the software. Okay, and we have a comment from O'Neill Speaks. O'Neill Speaks of Good Stewardship's Accounting. If any webinarees would like to discuss implementing internal controls for receiving funds and fund accounting systems with members of this webinar. Okay, so goodstewardaccounting.com. So it's goodstewardaccounting.com. Thank you. Somebody is making a suggestion here if you want to talk about controls for receiving funds. Thank you for that. That's a great comment. I'll highlight that. In fact, I'll also put that out when I do the recording and the slides. I'll remind people of that as well. As we kind of start winding down here a little bit, because we're kind of want to make sure we stay on time here, is one of the things also as good stewardship is you want to look at your financial health of your organization and know your full cost. Set aside some of your limited time to analyze the true cost of operating. This is something that churches don't always maybe do as well, which is think about sort of the operating realities of your church. What are the day-to-day expenses? How much cash do you need in the bank at the worst times of year to pay your bills on time? Again, churches are, a little more unique and have a kind of a at times different purpose because of, there's a lot more faith involved. But there also needs to be some reality checks about, for example, maybe you're a church. For example, I'll give you an example. I have a friend that works, he's a pastor of a church, and they have 90% of their money comes in from November through the 1st of January, 90% of their money. Well, part of the reason is because he works at a church that is a heavy farming community, and they wait till the end of the farming season to give their money for the year. So he has to work really hard to make sure that, their expenses have to be a lot lower at certain times of the year because of that, or they do a good job holding on to that cash to spend it on the things that they've designated for the year. So there's the things that you want to do as a good steward is look at healthy spending and planning around those. And do you have debt to repay, and what is your plan for repayment? Debt can be, just like anywhere, it can be a good and a bad thing for churches. Cash on hand, we talked about this at the beginning. I do want to encourage you as part of the stewardship plan is talk about cash on hand and what you as a church and mission or ministry believe is a healthy balance. Operating reserves are essential, meaning that you've got to have a rainy day fund at some level. If something big was to happen, how are you as a church going to be able to step in and make sure that you can continue to operate? The question most nonprofits struggle with is what is the appropriate amount to be set aside in operating reserves? And I believe this is true for churches. I think the larger you are, the more you should have. But that's not necessarily a rule for thumb. The point here is that be thinking about it and having that conversation about that. Here's just a few thoughts about that. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on these, but you'll get a copy of these. But on the surface, it would seem like that a church should have financial reserves if at all possible. There are implications that argue both ways on this issue. I don't have a right to answer one way or the other to say that these are some kind of things that you can look at as a way to kind of make some decisions, about having that cash on hand or what we call cash reserves. in terms of, are you meeting the current obligations? A church in California had reserves of nearly $250,000, but it was not current on its bills, even its utility bills. A witness of a church is damaged when it does not meet current obligations in a timely fashion. So that's an example of somebody that they had a lot of cash on hand, but they weren't being good stewards of being sure that they're paying bills and things like that. That some people would call that hoarding. Church members can feel that ministries are neglected if the church has reserves. So that would be something you want to address. Realistic reserves and communicating those reserves so people know that, hey, how come our budget's getting cut and we find out you've got X amount in the reserves? Leadership of a church could clearly communicate the purpose of a reserve fund. Consider a cap, meaning maybe as a board or as a church, you say that 25% will be all or something like that. Reserves can relieve stress on church leaders. You all know as a church leader, if you are part of the fundraising, that it's a very stressful thing to think about, especially when times are tight. And so the reserves can be helpful in that way. The flip side of that is reserves can also lull members into complacency. So things to think about financial health and having that cash on hand. And then let's kind of wrap up with our last point on stewardship, which is to review and monitor giving trends within your congregation and membership. So this is actually on the giving side of things. When it comes to determining how efficient your nonprofit operates, I don't think there's anything quite as helpful as a large pool of accurate, relevant indicators of who's giving, how much they're giving, and how they're giving. So these are just, again, some different things you might want to look at. Again, if you're not using software of any kind, I would encourage you to look into some real basic fundraising software, donor management software, membership management software, or accounting software. One or all of those can really help you with this. So some things you might want to think about looking at is, what percentage of your congregation or your people give, or your mission partners give, or people that are supporting you, what percentage? So if there's 500 people, or you have 300 people, or you have 50 people, with it that are a part of your and they don't have to be members, but what percentage of those are giving? Is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is it half? That's going to give you a good indicator of something you might need to work on. What's the average gift size? And are those going up and down each year? And we can certainly share with you some metrics on how to pull those kind of numbers. Do you have new donors? How many new donors each year? Just side by side, are you able to track in the last 3 years how many new donors you brought to your church or mission? How many donations did your organization receive this year? And again, that's going to be an indicator as well. What channels did those donations come from? Channels represent the different way in which people are giving to your organization. Channels represent maybe some people just give online, some people give via the website, some people only give through the offering plate, some people only mail in their check, some people respond to different things differently. So you want to look at the different channels, and if you only have one or two ways for people to give, you might think about expanding that a little bit. How many gifts did your church receive over a set amount of time? Meaning, what percentage of your gifts are coming in December versus January, February, July, something like that. These are just, again, some things that you can look at, discuss with your committees, with your leadership, amongst yourselves, to talk about ways you can increase the giving to your church or mission. Is there gift growth, meaning are people giving more over a period of time? Pledge fulfillment rate. This is really, and donor retention rate. This is really big. Are people signing up in January to give a certain amount and not fulfilling those pledges? And do you have, strategies in place to sort of monitor that and encourage people on that in that area, as well as donor retention? Donor retention means how many people that gave last year and the year before and the year before that are still giving, capturing those people that maybe are falling off the radar. Sometimes, again, this could be a sensitive area, but sometimes, just people being aware that you're aware that maybe they're there was a job loss in the family, and there's an opportunity for a group of people to go and pray for that family or something like that. This isn't at all anything to make anybody feel badly about or guilt, but just awareness for you to know how you can continue to increase your stewardship. Reoccurring giving, to me is a big one, in that because people are traveling more and they're just more mobile than ever before, making sure you have a reoccurring giving program in place. And the last is understanding the age breakdown of your congregation or your support base, and understanding their giving habits. The reality is that younger people give differently than older people. Again, I can't emphasize utilizing that technology more. So that's kind of the last kind of major point on that. And I'm going to leave you my contact information. You're very welcome. I'm going to sign off and hope to hear from you or see you guys at another webinar. Thanks a lot, everybody.